first ever as part of EXPO Chicago. We're a humble addition to a long history of curatorial conferences, of course, but we're thrilled to be here together, assembled today. And thank you, Kate, thank you, EXPO, Scott, Megan, for all your help in organizing this event over the next couple of days. So good morning, everyone. Good. Everybody has had some coffee, I hear. As Kate said, my name is Renaud Proch. I'm the director of Independent Curators International, or ICI for short. We're an organization based in New York, and since 2 years ago, with an office here in Chicago as well. An organization that supports the work of curators and their work in supporting artists, in organizing arts communities, we support their work at all levels of their careers through professional development programs that empower their vision to be as bold as possible in their work, public programs that raise awareness for the role of the curators in society, and also traveling exhibitions that champion collaboration, experimentation, and international engagement. One example of such an exhibition is Actions for the Earth, which is currently on at the Block Museum, which I hope you'll all have a chance to see. So it's my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here this morning to Curating and the Commons. This conference, organized with EXPO Chicago, is part of a 9-year-long ongoing collaboration with EXPO, a partnership over organizing the Curatorial Forum. So I want to thank all the curators from the Curatorial Forum, the Curatorial Exchange, the Curatorial Seminar in Detroit, the Chicago Curatorial Assembly, who have made it here this morning, as well as all of you for taking time of your busy week to be with us. On this stage 2 years ago, the keynote was delivered by Kwoyo Kuo, the director and chief curator of Zeitsmoka in Cape Town, South Africa. And she reminded us at the beginning of her presentation of the importance of supporting curators. We all know, and we all, I think, exercise in our lives, and I say all because I believe we share this, all of us in the room, we all know the importance of supporting artists and supporting their role in society. But we also need to think about the support needed for the ecosystem that surrounds artists. And in particular, within that ecosystem, the role of the curator, which I believe, of course, is critical. Curators champion the work of artists. They connect audiences to their work, and they need support too. Supporting curators, of course, includes the sharing of ideas as well as the sharing of resources. And that's particularly important because the conditions in which curators have accomplished their work has changed so much over the last decade, or maybe even 2 decades. The context in which they develop their practice has changed along with broader audiences, along with broader definitions of art practices, of art communities, of a more globally interconnected cultural landscape. So Curating and the Commons will offer a space in which to encourage the kind of supportive sharing of ideas that we're talking about, and highlighting curatorial and artistic approaches that I believe can guide us in this changing and somewhat uncertain period in the curatorial and museum fields. The program we have put together for you over the next couple of days, in large part comes out of our work with the Curatorial Forum since 2015. And the opportunity that the Curatorial Forum offered us to think together with curators once a year, every year, over the last 9 years, about the state of curatorial affairs, you can call it. Over the years, with our partners in Chicago and with the curators who took part in the curatorial forum, a total of more than 250 curators from communities across the US and many more from around the world. We learned a few things. We learned that some concerns have remained the same as we struggle to find answers. Sustainability, creating space for experimental practice, for example, or dealing with the discriminatory nature of our curatorial work. We cast light on certain artistic practices and leave others in the shadow. We live in the kind of inequity of the very foundations of our cultural institutions. And there's other concerns that have only become louder and more urgent over the last few years. And I think perhaps are signaling the necessity for a big shift in our thinking as art professionals. First, our relationship to history and collective memory, engaging in the process of unforgetting. Also, two, redefining where we stand and how we stand where we are, our relationship to space, to land, to territory, and how we make space as curators. And finally, how we engage community to build a different future. These three ideas are what we will focus on in the next 2 days and think through together with practitioners, curators, artists, researchers, organizers, very often all included in the same person, who have followed for some time now, who we have followed for some time now, and who have deeply inspired us at ICI. I'm so thankful to all our panelists for sharing their work with us today and tomorrow. As we will hear, their approaches and their practices are often relational, deeply human in scale, and while the specifics of their work may remain local, their work represents really a global perspective that addresses global shifts. We hope that these models of curatorial practice will excite your imagination and inspire you in your work shaping the arts communities of tomorrow. And to get us started in this journey, I'm so pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Miguel López. Miguel was chief curator and later co-director of Teoretica in Costa Rica, an incredible arts organization. And he was in those roles from 2015 to 2020. And before that, he was curator of Lugar a Dudas in Colombia. He also recently curated a traveling retrospective exhibition of Cecilia Vicuña that opened at Kunstinstituut Meli in Rotterdam in 2019. And currently, Miguel is the curator of the 2024 edition of the Toronto Biennial with Dominique Fontaine, a biennial which, in the curator's own words, will showcase the ways artists from different localities respond to the impact of the aftermath of colonialism on everyday life and how art can participate in the process of restoring disrupted social bonds. The biennial opens on September 21st, so make a note of that date and plan your trip to Toronto. I'm deeply grateful to Miguel for having accepted our invitation to share his work with us today. His practice has been a source of inspiration for all of us at ICI, even if from a distance. To me, he has defined a practice that is deeply self-aware of its own origins and its own history, a practice that indeed champions the process of unforgetting, as I was talking about before. It's a practice that commits itself to artists whose work, identities, personalities, and personas responded to moments in history in radical ways, and whose practice holds those around them witness to a different reality taking place right in front of our very eyes, but whose work did not always find their place in history. And in this process of unforgetting, Miguel's practice is also shaped by, and perhaps it's impacted our understanding of the idea of collective practice, collaboration, and the importance of the network in contemporary thinking. And yet, while doing all this, this reframing of authorship still allows for the singularity of one voice, of the voice we hear from artist or from the curator. And that voice remains strong within the collective. So without further ado, please give a big round of applause and help me welcome Miguel López. I was looking for you here.
Hello, good morning. Thank you so much, Reno, for these really beautiful words. I'm really honored to be here. It's a real pleasure to be with you all this morning. Old friends, new friends. To keep thinking about what it makes sense for us as curators and how our work is making a difference in the present time. And I wanted to share a few projects that I've been developing in the last few years, in the last decade actually, that I think could be important to keep thinking about the theme of this encounter, curating and the commons. So first, I wanted to say thank you, Renaud, thank you, Megan, thank you, Kate, thank you, Scott, thank you, Becky, thank you, ICI and EXPO Chicago for organizing this encounter. I am honored to deliver a keynote lecture following the steps of respected curators and friends who have marked my path. Koyo Kuo, Jesus Carrillo, Sally Tallant, Jochen Boltz, just to name a few of them, were important influences in my involvement with curatorial practice. Their work taught me the importance of building communities and alliances and shaped my understanding of curatorship as a politically situated practice. We constantly learn from colleagues developing new curatorial models in different parts of the world. ICI has been creating awareness and connections between curators across many geographies to shift traditional hierarchies and power structures in the art field. The Independent Vision Curatorial Award that ICI gave me in 2016 was significant as a personal recognition and an assertion that what others of us were doing in distant corners of the world can permeate and influence many spheres. As we all know, introducing changes and rethinking our practice isn't a small task. Curators are part of a larger cultural field anchored in a white Western art historical canon until recently. I grew up in Lima, Peru, a context where educational practice continued to perpetuate dominant Eurocentric values. My final year of high school in 2000 coincided with the fall of the Fujimori dictatorship, marking the end of 2 decades of a highly violent armed conflict that was the result of colonial structures of power, discrimination, and racism, which left a toll of 70,000 people dead and more than 50,000 people disappeared. After being expelled from university, yes, I was expelled from university, for skipping classes and taking courses that were not part of my program, I joined the photography school in Lima, which had an outstanding faculty. I didn't care about the degrees as much as being around people who inspired me. But even when I was trained as an artist, I always knew that I wanted to be a writer and tell stories. My first contact with curatorial practice was through the texts I wrote about the exhibitions I visited in Lima and the events that I intuitively started to organize. Around 2006, I began curating exhibitions, learning from observing and asking local curators questions about how they have done this or that. My first exhibitions were revisions of the experimental art practices from the 1960s and 1970s in Peru, bringing back artist voices and documentation of experimental art experiences that were absent in local art history due to the lack of scholarly programs and publications. Self-education and self-organization became an essential aspect of my practice. These first shows were quite ambitious, considering I had no formal training in curating. The artists I met at that time shaped my perception of curatorial practice as an operation of countering erasure and centering the margins. This is a 1960 environment by Teresa Burga, an amazing Peruvian conceptual artist that, as Renaud mentioned it a few minutes ago, it is one of these artists that didn't fit in history, and which is really beautiful. But it's really beautiful about these, encounters with artists is that after this first exhibition, like group exhibitions around the 60s, about the 60s and 70s, we continue working together. And in 2010, I co-curated her first retrospective in Lima, in Peru. She was 75, and that was actually the first time that her work was seen again after almost 25 years. And this is a photo of Teresa at the entrance of the Istanbul Biennial, where she was showing her work in 2011. Adriano Pedrosa visited the show I co-curated in 2010 and invited her to the biennial, so we traveled together. And that was actually the first time that her important conceptual artworks produced in the 1970s were shown outside Peru. Making exhibitions, trying and failing, listening to the artists, and responding to what I felt was urgent to my context was the school I had. The theme of this forum, Curating and the Commons, tackles the cliché of the lone curator or individual genius curator, the prevalent ideas of the curator as celebrity, and the perception of success as defined by neoliberal values and the global market. Considering this, it seems to be an excellent occasion to address non-formalized ways of understanding curatorship, a constellation of strategies and models that arise from the specificity of localized needs, as well as different ways of collectivizing resources, knowledge, and space within the curatorial practice. Let me share 3 projects with you. I don't want to hold them up as one might call successful examples of curatorial commoning, but as situated experiences that could help us to keep thinking about the potential of decentralization and imagining infrastructural models of working together. The first case is a glimpse of a project close to my heart, the Museo Travesti, founded by the late drag queen and philosopher Giuseppe Campuzano, a powerful project whose collection was a collective resource for the transgender community. The second is the exhibition Losing Human Form, a seismic image of the 1980s in Latin America, collectively curated by Red Conceptualismos del Sur at the Reina Sofía Museum in Madrid in 2012. I wanted to bring this case to think about the possibilities of collective articulation. The third is experience of collective directorship at Teoretica, a nonprofit visual arts organization in San Jose, Costa Rica, which moved from a paradigm of power centralized in a single person to a collective leadership and a dynamic of co-responsibility. This may be ambitious for one lecture, I know, but arises from generosity, so please bear with me. The first case is the Museo Travesti, the Transvestite Museum, a queer experimental museum founded by the late drag queen philosopher and activist Giuseppe Campuzano in Lima in 2003. Halfway between performance, activism, and curatorial research, this project was a visual, historical, and philosophical archaeology of the practice of travestismo, or drag practices, aiming to empower the struggles of the transgender community in Peru. Giuseppe wanted to put forward a trans historical imagination that opposes the idea that trans is a recent invention, highlighting forms of non-binary and transgender existence that predate Western colonization of the Americas. My encounter with the Museo Travesti in 2003 was crucial in my life. Giuseppe was a beloved friend and partner in crime on countless adventures. Coming across this museum at the age of 19 helped me to assess how the experience of growing up in a patriarchal and homophobic context was affecting me, especially by being constantly penalized for straying from violent masculine norms. The last project we did together was a book of Giuseppe's writings in a moment when they were giving a brave battle against sclerosis. Giuseppe passed away in November 2013. From very early on, Giuseppe understood that to fracture the centrality of heteronormative narratives presented as history, they had to cannibalize the museum, one of modernity's most effective apparatuses of political discipline, one of the most sophisticated Western promises of truth. And here on the left, we can see one of the first public apparitions of the Museo Travesti in Lima in 2004, in the public space. The Museo Travesti never had a physical space, but it did have a collection of appropriations that, as Giuseppe liked to say, and I quote, sabotages other museums, a museum of reproductions, precariousness being its greatest power, end of quote. It wasn't a collection of queer objects, but an operation of queering the historiographic methods, forms of display, and the systems of normative meanings that were passed on as truth. One of its more potent presentations was a parasitic intervention in an on-site museum dedicated to a 19th century war between Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. And this is one of the galleries of the permanent exhibition of that museum in Lima. The title of this intervention was Certamen, el otro sitio, Competition, the other side, in a playful allusion to the military combat, but also to drag queen pageantry. Giuseppe rearranged items from the museum's permanent collection into a provocative and ironic commentary. They deployed a non-gendered mixture of objects, cheaply printed photos, photocopies, textiles, crafts, press clippings, and replicas of pre-Columbian artifacts, among other elements, confronting patriarchal symbols of nationalism with the living traces of the struggles of queer and transgender communities, mostly invisible in official records. Here, for example, we see a fictional transgender version of the Peruvian ID, of Giuseppe's ID document, leaning in front of the portrait of Andrés Avelino Cáceres, former president of Peru, who was considered the patron of the Peruvian army. Of course, Giuseppe was not alone. They were part of a community of friends, locas, drag performers, sexual workers, and transgender activists who, amid a violent armed conflict, created safe spaces for collective love, wacky art, and self-expression, struggling both in the streets and in the parties. This affective landscape of transgressive revolt and queer fury was one of the driving forces behind the wildest fantasies of the Museo Travesti. The concept used by Giuseppe to create narratives across the collection were witty and sharp. Notions include duality, epic, therapeutic, courage feather or featherly, took the feather as a pretext to chart a queer journey that starts with the imperial dress of Manco Cápac, the leader of the Inca Empire in the 13th century, continues with colonial religious portraits by indigenous painters from the 17th and 18th centuries, to arrive to contemporary drag shows and their increased presence in mass media. Presenting Manco Cápac as the first loca, as part of a genealogy of indigenous drag performers, was a brilliant curatorial gesture. It stressed the crucial role of speculation in reclaiming an erased transgender memory. If the Incas were one of the most significant drag queen communities and we didn't know, that means that history must be urgently rewritten. Sometimes fictionalizing or falsifying history is the only way to at least scratch reality. Giuseppe avoided defining themselves as a curator. The fact that in Latin America, the curators were often confused with curanderos or spiritual healers was used as their perfect alibi to fantasize with a family tree not of curators but of shamans, whose practice moves body energy, activates deeper consciousness, and rearranges the structures of desire and subjectivity. Perhaps this is not so different from how Koyo Kuo describes curators as spirit workers. She usually says that we are not, or not only, cultural workers, we are workers of the spirit. In a similar way, Giuseppe didn't want to be the curador del museo, the museum's curator, but a queer shaman of the musexo, of the musex, forging alliances between the transgender struggles and indigenous ancestry. Giuseppe achieved this invocation of a cosmic shamanic androgynous past and future through actions, performances, and videos. In one of them, I will show you in a second, Giuseppe appears cross-dressed as Mater Dolorosa, singing a nostalgic song formed by one single word, ajajay, which can be translated as "oh, oh, oh." They are holding a vinyl record, creating a partial solar eclipse with their body. At the bottom of the screen, board plates evoke the transgender experience as the colonial resistance.
Ay, 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 jai, 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 ay, jai, 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 jai. Ay, 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 jai, 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 ay, jai, 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 jai.
Giuseppe envisioned the Museo Travesti's collection and archive as a collective resource, not only as a representation but from a performative perspective. A collection where meaning was built through collective use. Since the beginning of the project, Giuseppe and numerous friends reenacted and staged multiple characters and elements from the collection. These actions were ritual reanimations in the form of Andean celebrations. It was like the entire museum came to life, a performative reenactment that merged past and future, inside and outside, calling for alternative formulations that challenge the Western conception of time. In Andean philosophy, the Quechua term pacha, refers to a locus of life and temporality that is not linear, but based on cyclical loops, akin to the dynamics of cosmic life. Giuseppe was unfolding a particular way of curatorial experimentation, reclaiming a bodily and erotic relationship to knowledge. It is pretty telling that several of these characters began to populate the Pride marches in Lima shortly after. The Museo Travestis collection appears as a community-based collective knowledge grounded in experience and queer social interaction. History, Giuseppe seems to say, can be only built cooperatively. The Museo Travesti left the scene of knowledge open for us to begin again, for us to fantasize, to unlearn, to deorganize, to dynamite normative limits, to undermine places of power and authority, to interrupt, to falsify, to ironize, infiltrate, disassemble, and make the very idea of the museum strange, to throw the heteronormative gaze into the trash, to cross-dress, to shape a trans future. The second case is the exhibition Losing Human Form, collectively curated by Red Conceptualismos del Sur. But before talking about the show, I will share some context. In 2007, a group of 6 people, Fernando Davis, Ana Longoni, Cristina Freire, Graciela Carnevale, Emilio Tarazona, and I, co-founded Red Conceptualismos del Sur, in English, the Southern Conceptualisms Network, which I will call here for abbreviation the RED, meaning network. The RED is an effective and activist entanglement of people born out of a common interest to preserve archives of creative practices that intertwine art and politics since the 60s and 70s in Latin America. We insisted that these materials were sources of our history and living antagonistic forces, capable of reintroducing a desire for social transformation against neoliberal forces. I was an active member of the RED during 2007 and 2014. The ideas I will share here relate to projects I participated in during that time. One of our first initiatives in 2007 was cartographies. Developed first with the support of MACBA Museum in Barcelona and later in collaboration with Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, Cartographies was a multi-year research project on the state of the archives of critical art practices in South America, which helped us to elaborate a map of decentralized actions for the next few years. Collective research was oriented to discuss how to create conditions for preserving archives in our context, seeking alliances with local institutions to house these documents and allow digital accessibility. This task wasn't easy in places where the artistic communities distrusted the existing governmental institutions due to their authoritarian past. One of the initial archival projects was the conversion of the archive of the Uruguayan poet and artist Clemente Padín into a public documentation center in Montevideo. During years of harsh political repression, Padín was a driving force of the male art networks across Latin America and Eastern Europe. In 2009, in collaboration with the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, the RED developed a diagnostic of his archive to elaborate a plan for its cataloging and conservation. This project, mainly coordinated by Argentinian art historian Fernando Davis, continued with a partnership with the Universidad de la República, a public university in Montevideo. After 10 years of custody, the artist, Padin, donated it to the university in 2020, where it is open for public consultation. Diving into the archives and patiently recovering forgotten material gave rise to a different way of conceptualizing an exhibition, in which the narratives don't depend on conventional categories established art figures or Latin American art stars. An example of this is Perder la forma humana, una imagen sísmica de los años 80 en América Latina, Losing Human Form, a seismic image of the 1980s in Latin America, collectively curated by The Red in Madrid in 2012. The project, presented in Lima in 2013 and in Buenos Aires in 2014, was a reading of the 1980s through the lens of creative social disobedience. The show rendered a complex panorama of the 1980s by retrieving experiments that put forward forms of resistance through fragile and precarious supports. The show was genuinely ambitious, yes, including more than 400 materials installed across 16 rooms that took up almost half of the third floor of the Reina Sofia Museum. With the participation of around 30 researchers, the exhibition showed the results of a project focused on South America, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, and Peru, with specific case studies in Mexico and Colombia. And I'm going to show now a short excerpt of the video of the curatorial introduction. It's just 2 minutes. I think it's a good introduction for the project.
Perder la forma humana, el título de esta exposición, nos parece una imagen muy precisa de la mutación. Por un lado, los efectos arrasadores sobre los cuerpos que ocasionó la represión que instaló en diversos puntos de América Latina el terrorismo de Estado y las dictaduras y las guerras civiles y conflictos internos. Y por otro lado también las respuestas que se fueron generando ante esta situación de terror vigente y que dieron lugar a infinidad de respuestas colectivas o moleculares ante la represión, ante el terror. Y por eso nos parece que una buena imagen de esta tensión es entre el terror y la fiesta. La idea de que un cúmulo de experiencias colectivas o moleculares que surgieron dieron respuestas inéditas, inventaron nuevas formas de vida, nuevas formas de hacer arte en medio de ese contexto muy hostil. El clima de derrota que se instaló en el continente luego de la clausura que implicaron estas dictaduras, de los proyectos emancipadores que se habían vivido en la época anterior, en los 60, 70s. El nuevo periodo más bien va a tener que ver con la reinvención de la política luego de la dura represión que se instala en ese periodo, y nos parece que la heterogeneidad de experiencias reunidas da cuenta de cómo el cuerpo aparece como protagonista de esas formas de hacer política, de reinventar la política con nada. Un tipo de exposición que no se basa en lo canónico, en lo conocido, en lo más establecido del arte de este periodo, sino que a partir de la investigación se han exhumado, se han dado a conocer una serie de episodios, de experiencias, de modos de hacer arte y política que no eran conocidos. Y nos parece muy bien o muy interesante el punto de no poner un límite entre obra y documento. Los registros, las escalas van variando y van haciendo relaciones inesperadas entre contextos que quizás no tuvieron una conexión directa entre sí, pero que agrupamos a partir de ciertas afinidades más bien conceptuales.
Entonces, algunos grupos trabajan deconstruyendo esta frontera entre lo masculino y lo femenino, dando a ver estas nuevas colectividades que estaban surgiendo en ese momento. Entonces, ahí vemos el trabajo del colectivo Gang, del movimiento de arte porno en Brasil, con sus acciones públicas, con los recitales de poesía porno, algunos montajes fotográficos que intentan de alguna manera poner en el espacio público la posibilidad de imaginar nuevas sexualidades. Aparece también muchos trabajos de parodia.
we had to invent a way of working together to make this exhibition. We were located in different geographies and time zones. We organized ourselves into four working groups. Each group met every 2 weeks for more than 2 years to discuss our case studies. We created chronologies, shared the materials, and the evolving hypotheses, and explored the connections between cases. It was a pre-Zoom and pre-WhatsApp era. We were on Skype for hours. We wanted to make the materials accessible to everybody in the group. Google Drive didn't exist as we know it today, so we sent and stored dozens of email attachments and documents. Collective deliberations were the first step in deciding what to include or not. But as we know, what sounds good in theory sometimes does not work well when translated into a three-dimensional space. We designated a curatorial team of 6 people to take the narrative and make it tangible. The process was highly demanding, but illuminating regarding what was possible to think collectively. And here on the left, we can see one of our many diagrams about the 1980s and the artists and the activists and the episodes and the context. And these 2 pictures are from the extended working sessions with Manuel Borja Villel, at the time director of Reina Sofia Museum, and the exhibitions team to decide about how to organize the exhibition in the space. This map, designed by researcher and curator Andre Mesquita, visualizes the episodes we trace. For us, traditional chronological timeframes cannot condense the 1980s meaning. We situated its origin in 1973 with the US-backed Pinochet military coup that toppled the government of Salvador Allende in Chile. This coup was the pillar of the genocidal politics implemented by other dictatorships in South America, and the first implementation of a neoliberal model before Margaret Thatcher's Britain and Ronald Reagan's United States. We situated the end of the 1980s in 1994, when the Zapatista movement inaugurated a new cycle of mobilizations and international solidarity on a global scale. The writer and thinker Stephen Bright was suitable when he said that our project was not interested in a chronological, but rather a political understanding of the 1980s. This map also shows the 2 notions used to articulate the diverse practices included in the exhibition. Black lines represent relationships of affinity in English, and red lines relationships of contagion, or contamination in English. We defined affinity as the simultaneous deployment of political strategies in different places with no apparent connection, and contagion or contamination as direct transmission models, displacing knowledge and creative tools across geographies. One case of affinity relationships was the apparition of the graphic actions El Siluetazo, the silhouettes in Argentina, and No More in Chile, both in September 1983. These activist graphic tools, implemented by artists, 3 individuals in Argentina, and the Cada Collective in Chile, were an aesthetic resource to be socialized and easily dispersed, aiming to mobilize people who usually do not participate in demonstration. So basically, the operation was very simple. In the case of El Siluetazo in Argentina, they were creating silhouettes of people, and they were using these silhouettes in the Marchas de la Resistencia, in the March of Resistance during the dictatorship, to reclaim for the apparition of the disappeared people. And the No More was this very simple phrase that people can complete. In this case, for example, with a gun, but people were complete with whatever they wanted to say, like no more fear in this case, for example. So it was easily dispersed, and it was used actually quite intensely in Chile until the fall of the dictatorship. People were invited to appropriate the creative practice and to take up the struggle for justice. Another case could be the work of the queer collectives, Yeguas del Apocalipsis in Chile since 1987, and Grupo Chaclacayo in Peru since 1982. Both of them embrace poor, precarious drag performativity to address the effects of Western colonialism, the death sentence of homosexual and transgender bodies within a repressive heteronormative regime, and the imposition of moralizing rhetoric surrounding the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 1980s. A relationship of contamination is revealed in the praxis of artist and activist Fernando Bedoya, who brought screen printing knowledge from the Peruvian avant-garde scene of the late 1970s to human rights activism in Buenos Aires in the 1980s. The phrase arte al paso, in English art to go or art on the way, coined by the socialist group Huayco, Avalanche in English, in Lima, was appropriated by activists in Argentina to invite people to participate in civic actions, such as the large demonstration convened by the Association of Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, an organization of Argentine mothers whose children were disappeared by the dictatorship. And here we can see Fernando Bedoya on the right, screen printing with Eve de Bonafini, one of the founders of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo. This is in the streets of Buenos Aires in 1984. More than 30 people doing simultaneous research, visiting archives, and collective testimonies allow us to think transversally and contrast seemingly disconnected scenarios. Losing Human Form was not looking to create a consensus of the art of the 1980s in Latin America, but to move beyond the established art narratives of the period to pay attention to forms of social cooperation where art appears as a provisional, ambiguous, unstable, and transitive category. We wanted to create a different map of creative practices and episodes of social protest carried out by a wide range of social actors. This is, for example, one of the galleries dedicated to the underground and countercultural scenes in Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. We pay attention to forms of energy and inventiveness that we felt were one step ahead of the traditional art and politics binary. This collaborative synergy of 30 people brought complexity and depth to the curatorial research and made possible a collective vision beyond what any individual could foresee and achieve. The project also aimed to generate social infrastructure for collective articulation and participation. One of these infrastructures is Archivos en Uso, Archives in Use, a website giving public access to various collections of documents consolidated through our collective research processes. This platform presents archives as a shared resource for political imagination and an opportunity to consider different policies for systematizing archives. And this is the Archives in Use project was launched as part of the exhibition. So at the end of the Losing the Human Form exhibition, we installed a number of computers, and the website is active and it's been growing since then. So you are very invited to take a look. And I think this website and the project in itself is a testimony of the power of collective work. The third and last case is about the experience of the collective leadership at Teoretica that started in 2018. The experience of collective leadership started that year. That is the change from a vertical, centralized governance model by a single person to a collective directorship shared by several people. One important aspect that helped make such a change possible is Theoretica's small scale and small team, 11 people. Theoretica is a non-profit visual arts organization founded in 1999 by Virginia Pérez Raton, a Costa Rican artist and curator who passed away in 2010. The name Theoretica was born from the combination of three words: theory, ethics, and aesthetics. Since its inception, Theoretica has reclaimed art as a public sphere by fostering a program responsive to the social realities of Central America and the Caribbean, including conferences, study sessions, editorial projects, grants, exhibitions, and the creation of a library and archive dedicated to contemporary art from the region. This is a map of Central America. Many people confuse Costa Rica for Puerto Rico and think Costa Rica is an island. It is not an island. One important thing to say is that in Central America, the art infrastructure is extremely precarious and fragile. And that is why Theoretica, since the very beginning, has been focused on generating programs that impact the whole region. I first joined Theoretica as chief curator in 2015. A few months before my arrival, in the absence of an artistic director or chief curator at the institution, three future colleagues of mine, Daniela Morales, Paula Piedra, and Lola Malabasi, briefly implemented an intuitive experiment in collective leadership, even when it was not explicitly referred to as such. That led to several growing questions about the role of the institution in the local context and the effects of the programs we put in motion. That was the seed of what came to be the collective directorship a couple of years later. A big challenge I faced upon my arrival was defining a program in a context I had yet to get to know in depth. I needed to get close to the people who advanced critical reflections on the Central American region. One early decision was to reactivate Theoretica's printed publications program, to learn from what had come before. In 2016, I started the series Local Writings, Critical Positions from Central America, the Caribbean, and its diasporas, a collection of writings by curators, critics, and artists who play a crucial role in changing the conditions for thinking and creating art. Each book was a result of immersing myself in the author's archives. I took this photo in Managua, Nicaragua, while working with Raúl Quintanilla on his book that addresses the impact of the Sandinista revolution over cultural politics in the 80s and the changes implemented in the neoliberal 90s in Nicaragua. A starting point for the series was to consider how local knowledge could offer other origins for debate around the contemporary. The title of the fifth book in the series, Anna Lee Davis' On Being Committed to a Small Place, expressed this sentiment beautifully by considering what small places, in this case, art spaces in the post-independence Caribbean, can do to transform or shift the landscape of contemporary thinking. By the second half of 2016, we, in Theoretica, understood that to move further into imagining new collaborative institutional dynamic within the institution, it was necessary to take time to explore Theoretica's structure and undertake research on our positions. We had so many questions. But it's possible to move from a paradigm of power centralized in a single person to a dynamic of co-responsibility? What does it mean to run an institution? Can we all learn to do it? Is it possible to collectivize decision-making around budgets, programs, and the use of the space, mainly when it affects all of us? How can we embrace care, vulnerability, and interdependence more empathically within the institution? Some of these questions began to evolve after engaging in discussions with colleagues working at the intersection of art, education, and curating, such as of Sofia Olascoaga, Michi Marsuach, Diego del Pozo, the organization Beta Local in Puerto Rico, the Arts Collaboratory, an ecosystem of 25 organizations around the world, including Teoretica, among many other friends and colleagues. Asking ourselves what makes an art institution relevant today help us realize that the time and energy required for producing exhibitions didn't leave a moment for introspection. We acknowledge the need to decelerate, to create a space for thinking, and to work at a different speed. As a result, the first decision was to slow down. But how? In July 2015, Raw Material Company, an art center in Dakar, Senegal, announced that it withdrew from public activities for a year to pause for reflection. I remember reading that announcement with surprise. As Raw is part of the Arts Collaboratory Network, their decision to take a sabbatical probably influenced our early collective dialogues. By the second half of 2016, the concept of a time strike, taken from Arts Collaboratory Common Language, started to gain traction as a tool for us to pause. According to their future plan, a time strike is not a slogan, but a mechanism to change our relationship with work. It's a call for a strike against the current use of time, deadline after deadline, being busy, feeling anxious and overwhelmed, which harms our well-being and interpersonal relations. By the end of 2016, and after many conversations, internal conversations, we decided to go on what we called an exhibition strike. Teoretica's galleries were left empty in 2017 and repurposed as workspaces to study and propose a different form of articulation within the institution. So this is part of our collective brainstorming. You can read here, for example, in the middle, some of our proposals, making visible the administrative structure of Teoretica, transforming art administration into an artistic project. These were just ideas that we were, sharing how to transform art administration into an artistic project. The importance of shifting roles and responsibilities. The importance of prioritizing well-being and health of the theme. The idea of creating a bank of time in the middle, Banco de Tiempo, and having flexible working schedules, create mechanisms to circling back resources and involve other people in our decision-making about how to spend the institutional resources, how to spend the money. We're thinking, why should be just us deciding about how to use this money? What it will mean for us to invite different people to decide with us. Here on the right, there is this vocabulary that we were also thinking and using, notions such as self-organization, building prototypes, bridges, collaboration, solidarity, openness, inhabiting openness, sustainability, reciprocity, creating tools, self-empowerment. Well, there was a number of concepts that we were thinking and replacing all the time. And here on the left, there's more proposals. The title is Entrepierne, which was our own Spanish translation of the notion of entanglement, which was the way we envisioned the institution, like as a big entanglement. Exploring alternatives for institutional paradigm shifts was exciting, but I must admit that the exhibition strike prompted a challenging self-inquiry around my practice. Was a curator still necessary in an institution that no longer held shows? Was I dispensable? If I was hired to make exhibitions and that task was withdrawn, did that mean I failed to fulfill my duties? Should I continue within the institution or step aside? Even when exploring alternative definition of curation, it is revealing how the conventional compartmentalization of the practice based on individual exceptionalism haunts our imaginations. The outcome of the exhibition strike and the many months of studying the institution and ourselves led to a proposal of collective leadership, a proposal that we delivered to the administrative board of Theoretica by mid-2017. That first conversation was difficult because, according to the legal statutes of the institution and the legal frameworks in Costa Rica, the director of a cultural organization had to be an individual. As a result, the structures, politics, and economies behind the institutional organization began to move into the center of the conversation. In July 2017, the administrative board granted us a 6-month trial period, which they approved at the end of that year. In January 2018, Theoretica publicly announced the 5 co-directors and their collective governance model. The desire to learn collectively and disrupt the division between disrupt the division between those who conceptualize and those who administer the conceptualization within the institution was channeled into creating a space where anyone from the staff of Theoretica could run a project with the support of others. For example, Paula's project, UPE, a collective study project around the role of Theoretica in the neighborhood, developed with the neighbors and Semillas, SEED, a group that promotes community social architecture. I left the institution in December 2020, after 5 years as chief curator, and 3 years of collective governance. I moved back to Lima to be with my parents during the harsh moments of the pandemic. But also because Theoretica hired me under a different structure, and my departure was essential to reorganize the finances internally to achieve equity in compensation that was one of the aspirations of the collective leadership. As of today, Dani, Paula, and Lola run the institution. A few months ago, they published a book about the experience of collective directorship, taking the experience of Theoretica as a starting point to raise questions about what it means to build permeable institutions with a sense of justice and critical self-reflection. Sustaining collective work is complex. There have been moments of sadness, tension, euphoria, fun, and joy. The desire to develop research about Theoretica led us to a kind of a study based on spending time with each other, creating tools to work better, and demanding that our emotions have a valuable place in our decisions and actions. This model was driven by the premise of collective learning and the desire to trigger conversations around decentralization, co-responsibility, and alternative forms of leadership to hold one another accountable. Moving beyond the individual role of the director from a particular class background that, in many cases, is not sustainable in the long run. In a global context where the neoliberal patriarchal white supremacist model organizes many art institutions, we wanted to imagine an institution that does not disregard but embraces the multiplicity of voices. It was significant to think that we were training ourselves to lead institutions differently. The three cases that I share here are very different, but they have in common a desire to imagine forms of decentralization and collective organizational structures. These cases are partial and imperfect experiments in commoning, a queer archive collection envisioned as a collective resource for the transgender community, a large-scale exhibition based on collective research and articulation across Latin America, and the change of Theoretica's governance structure to build a dynamic of co-responsibility and collective leadership. They invite us to pay attention to the potentiality of togetherness and the role of experimentation, trust, openness, and affectivity as critical aspects of unlearning and expanding what is possible within received knowledge of curating. Thank you.